I'm here today with John Werring, biologist with the David Suzuki Foundation, and we're here to talk about to sort some of the myths and the real concerns here from the issues surrounding the blowout, the tailing pond breach. Pond is probably the wrong word. Large containment dam, Mount Polley Mine near Quesnel Lake in British Columbia. There's been a tremendous amount of media coverage and anxiety around what's going on up there and what kind of testing is being done by the ministry with regards to water quality and potential fish and human health impacts. And so we've got an expert here today in this field to point us in the right direction and give us a sense of where the real concerns lie, where the information gaps are, and what sort of research needs to be done going forward for the public to know what we're dealing with. So, John, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Damien. Thanks for having me.
So maybe you could start with, there's been some testing that's been done recently by the ministry, some results that have been published on their website, and I'm curious what you've found in your own research into those statements that have been made, any of the data that has been published or hasn't been published, and where you see the gaps lie. Maybe you can give us just a general primer on that.
Well, let me start by saying I don't think that enough has been done to try and determine the true extent of what is going on. Certainly, water quality samples have been taken in Quesnel Lake, downstream of Quesnel Lake, and in Polley Lake, and the results are coming in, and they're coming in fairly slowly. I'm not surprised by what I'm seeing where it comes to water quality test results downstream in Quesnel River, near the town of Lakely, in the areas where we know people live. And I would be comfortable as a biologist and having done water quality tests and analysis for over 20 years, to believe that the results that I'm seeing are confirm that this is not as big a disaster as people think it is in terms of toxicity, immediate tox, based on the results that we're seeing. So bathing in the water and drinking the water would probably not be problematic. I've heard stories from First Nations where they're saying they're not going to fish at all because of this disaster, even as far down as in the Fraser River. In my personal view, I think that's an incorrect position to take. I personally do not think that the concentrations of chemicals that may be released in this mine would have any impact on Fraser River fish. Possibly, there may be some impact on fish that swim up the Quesnel River into Quesnel Lake, past the breach at Hazeltine Creek. There may be some impacts. We don't know what those will be, but they will be measured, hopefully, in the long term. And that's what we would need. I don't believe that the fish will be exposed to chemicals to the point where they will be there for a long term and have really detectable immediate impact. So like if a fish swims through this plume and comes out the other end, would I catch it and eat it? Personally, yes. That's my opinion at this point in time. However, there are some very significant environmental consequences associated with this spill, and they are more long-term than immediate. What we know immediately is that the tailings that were behind the dam were underwater. They were managed, and that's what tailings ponds do. There are toxic chemicals and metals in those tailings that, as long as they're pretty much not exposed to air, as long as there's no oxidation occurring, it's likely that those metals and chemicals will stay bound up in sediments. However, in this particular case, we have millions of tons of toxic, potentially toxic tailings that have been discharged outside the dam. They're no longer covered by water. What do we know about those? We don't know a lot. What do we know about what's likely to happen? We don't know a lot. But what we do know is that despite the fact that the mine says that these tailings are what they call non-acid generating, which is a good thing, quite frankly, because if these were acid generating tailings and they had problems with acid mine drainage, that would cause heavy metal leachate into the environment and we would have a toxic situation. At this point in time, there's no evidence to suggest that that has been the case. However, now those tailings are exposed to the elements, they can become acid generating. And over the long term, we may be seeing impacts here that are not measured at this point.
What about some of the other chemicals? You and I talked about this before, about some of the chemical reagents, as they're referred to, which are used in the extraction process, the milling process, to separate the gold or the copper from what's called the gangue, which is the surrounding unwanted elements. You were telling me about some of the potential toxic effects, even calling them poisons, with two particular chemical reagents that you know have been used at this particular mine. What are the risks there? What do we know, and what are we missing?
Well, it is correct. This is a mining operation, and their objective is to mine ore, grind the ore, and then add chemicals, which are called process chemicals, to that ore in order to extract metals. In this particular case, because it's a copper mine, the two main chemicals that are being used are sodium diethyl dithialphosphate and potassium amyl xanthate, and that has been acknowledged by the company. The problem that we have with mining operations in Canada is that for the most part, the kinds and amounts of chemicals that are used to extract the ore are trade secrets and therefore are not reportable in any kind of a form or database. As in, for example, we do know the approximate amounts of things like cyanide, cadmium, lead, mercury, and all the heavy metals that could be potentially found in the ore. And I just want to qualify that those chemicals or those metals they're found in the natural environment. The problem is with tailings is that the tailings are ground so fine that those metals, which would normally be bound up in solid rock and not exposed to weathering, are now subject to weathering through things like acid mine drainage or simply the fact that they're now exposed to air. There may be some oxidation occurring and you get dissolution. But these other process chemicals that are used by mines are not even mentioned in the NPRI, nor are they required, the mines required to report on the concentration in the discharge that goes into the tailings pond. These two particular chemicals that I've mentioned are highly toxic. Sodium diethyl dithialphosphate is a level 3 poison. It has impacts on human beings, and it has impacts, it's specifically stated as highly toxic to aquatic life. Potassium amyl xanthate, similarly, is highly toxic to aquatic life. What we don't know is how much has been discharged to these tailings. We don't know the fate of these potential chemicals once they get in the tailings ponds, because over time there is a potential with chemicals like this to degrade, either by exposure to sunlight or biological activity. But because we don't measure those things, we have no idea what concentrations are there.
So there's no historical monitoring of these particular chemicals
None.
from the ministry?
Well, no, I'm not going to say none. In this particular case, in the report that I read that was put together looking at the long-term environmental impacts associated with this mine and the application to discharge water to Quesnel Lake, the mine acknowledges that they use these two chemicals and that potassium amyl xanthate on an annual average would be at a level of it was 7 grams per liter, which is higher than the aquatic life guidelines. However, they say that the majority of these chemicals that they use actually remain in the froth or whatever they use to extract the metals and are not discharged to the tailings pond. That's a wonderful statement to say, but nobody is measuring it.
Mm.
There's absolutely no mention of the kinds and concentrations and the treatment of sodium diethyl dithialphosphate, which is even more toxic. My concern as a citizen and as a biologist is if mines are using toxic chemicals like this, and I just want to qualify, it's not only mines that use these chemicals, but they're also used in local wastewater treatment plants. They're used as what they call flocculants and coagulants, so that when the tailings are discharged to the tailings pond, they are suspended in the water column. And so these chemicals are added to cause them to sink faster so that the supernatant or the water over top of the ponds is clear. But even when they do measurements over time and they look at, well, what are the concentrations of metals in the tailings pond water and what are the concentrations of metals in the tailings, they do not look at these chemicals. So we are completely in the reported, and we are also in the dark about the concentration and quantity that is used and how that is delivered to the aquatic environment. Now, if these mine tailings are toxic, and if we need to measure the toxicity, we should absolutely be considering measuring these chemicals as well as the metals that we know are in there.
To your knowledge, is any of that measuring happening alongside the heavy metals that are being tested for downstream from the tailings pond breach today by ministry officials? Because I'm currently waiting on responses from the communications people from the ministry right now as to that question. Do you have any insight yourself as to whether that's being done right now?
Well, I would probably suggest that the answer to that question is no. Only because in the last few days I have been making inquiries with laboratories here in Canada, mainly the main laboratories that deal with the analysis of chemicals and the labs that are being used by the Ministry of Environment right now to do the background water quality testing results. And they have told me that they do not have the capability to measure these contaminants.
Interesting. You've mentioned some other concerns in a previous discussion about some of the testing results that have been published. I know there was one particular inconsistency that you called the ministry on yesterday. Could you tell us about that and what other potential problems you've seen with the methodology and the data that's been published so far to largely reassure the public that drinking water is safe at this point? Are there any issues there that you're concerned about?
My main concern, Damien, is that the staff at the Ministry of Environment that are tasked with looking at this issue are hugely understaffed. They're stressed to the point of limit where it's possible that mistakes can be made. I was looking at the water quality test results that have been posted for the public on the Ministry of Environment website. In particular, metal concentrations in Polley Lake. And the reason that I focused on that was because a decision has been made to discharge water from Polley Lake into Hazeltine Creek and into Quesnel River.
And this is subsequent to the original breach. This is part of the ongoing management program, correct? That they're continuing to pump contaminated water out of Polley Lake into Hazeltine Creek?
Yes, and the main intention there is to relieve the rising water levels in Polley Lake. Polley Lake has been dammed by a whole bunch of tailings, and as a consequence, the outlet stream to Polley Lake is dammed. So the water level is rising, and there is a significant danger that that water could overtop or break through that dam and cause another slide. So one of the immediate mitigation options here is to take water out of that lake and put it somewhere. The mine is doing two things. One is they're pumping some of the water into some abandoned pits, and the rest of the water they want to discharge down Hazeltine Creek into Quesnel Lake. And so if there is a consequence, a potential consequence of, in my view, when I look at on the landscape and I look at the pictures that I've seen and what's happened at Polley Lake, I mean, a significant amount of tailings have gone in there. And when I looked at the water quality results, it struck me as odd that some of the reporting that was going on there was on extremely, well, what we would call the priority pollutants and the toxic chemicals or metals that we would be concerned about. One of them would be cadmium. And they were reporting, well, we have levels less than 0.000001 micrograms per liter, which is in the, what we would call in the classic sense, the parts per quadrillion range. I've been dealing with water quality testing for a long period of time, and I know that that's not possible. And I've contacted various labs, and they've confirmed it's not possible to measure these chemicals or metals at that level and adequately report on them. So I reported this to the Ministry of Environment, and they advised me that the data set that I was looking at was in error, and they're planning on fixing it. My concern with that is are these results that are being posted publicly the same results that the ministry is using to make the determination that it's safe to discharge that water?
Mm.
And I think that really needs to be determined. So I've also advised them in the short term immediately, do not discharge water from Polley Lake into Quesnel Lake until you can establish what has gone wrong with this reporting mechanism.
Mm.
And I want to be clear that all the other reports of water quality that I've looked at in relation to water quality in Quesnel Lake and downstream at Lakely are all, in my view, correct. There's no errors like this. But Polley Lake is a concern at this point because there is a movement, and one of the mine options is to take that water and discharge it into the lake. Now, looking at all the water quality results that have been compiled to this point in time, the area of greatest concern is at the mouth of Hazeltine Creek, where this material was entering the lake.
Mm.
There is water flow occurring both in the north, south, east, direction in that arm. There is water flow occurring that will go down into Quesnel Lake, but that, once they get into that large water body, you also have dilution, which is going to take care of a lot of the potential toxins and chemicals that we're seeing here. So downstream in Quesnel River, and even as far, Quesnel River then runs into the Caribou River. The Caribou River then runs into the Fraser River. If I were fishing in the Fraser River right now, I would not be concerned about this particular issue because I do not believe that the concentrations of any chemicals that come out of that mine would be at sufficient levels that they would even be detectable in the Fraser River. And if you're going to fish for fish, fish. One of the concerns I've heard from First Nations is that they're going to stop all fishing because of this disaster. And I think that's disastrous from a First Nations point of view. If they rely on these fish for sustenance and to keep them going for the year, I think that's an incorrect position to take. I don't think that they will be harmed by this material.
We saw pictures downstream in the Lillooet area of salmon with, it's just circulated all around Facebook, etc., of skin being peeled off of a salmon. Are you aware of that photo, and would you care to comment on that?
I am aware of that photo, and I would say at this point in time that my biggest concern in regards to the Fraser River at Lillooet, or the salmon that are currently migrating into the Fraser River, has less to do with pollution, because we know it occurs. And quite frankly, in the Fraser River itself, I would be more concerned about the contaminants and pollutants that are being discharged into the Fraser River from 3 pulp mills in Prince George and the 2 pulp mills in Quesnel and all the other industries along that river. But more than that, the temperatures in the river are getting very high. And what we may be seeing here is a consequence of that increase in temperature. When fish are moving upstream in the Fraser River and they encounter these warmer waters, now suddenly they're exposed to bacteria, viruses, or they're carrying bacteria and viruses that now become active. And this sloughing of flesh may become, and I would believe, honestly, at this point in time, given the distance and the location, completely unrelated to this mine disaster. But let's look at this in the big picture, from the point of view of climate change and increased water temperatures. I've stood on the Fraser River at Hope and downstream of Hope and watched thousands and thousands and thousands of dead fish washing downstream well before this incident ever occurred. I had concern then that something was going on. I have concerns now that something is going on. But I think we really need to step back and say, is what we're seeing in relation to these fish related to this mine? And it's my professional opinion that no, it's not related at this point in time.
Now, with regards to the question of dilution, Quesnel Lake is the deepest lake, as I understand, in British Columbia. It's a large lake, and there certainly is that potential for, as you mentioned, the effluent that's being dumped in there through Hazeltine Creek to be diluted. I've seen satellite imagery in the last day or two, which you've probably seen yourself. It does appear to show some traces of particulate working its way up to the north end of the lake, where the Quesnel River departs heading for Fraser. Are you concerned about those signs? Is there, despite the size of the depth of the lake, is it still possible that levels of contamination that aren't entirely negligible are working their way through that system?
It is possible, but we will not know unless we continue this long-term and short-term monitoring and taking regular samples to determine a change. And what's more concerning to me at this point, Damien, is that this disaster happened on August the 4th. It is now August the 14th. That hole in the dam has not yet been plugged. There is still material discharging from that tailings pond. I am absolutely concerned that the response that we're seeing in terms of, okay, if this is a disaster, why are we not responding to it quicker? Why is equipment not there? I have not seen one single video or photo of anybody making any attempt to try and plug that hole in that tailings dam. and yet water is still leaking out of there. Tailings are still discharging. And in this point of time, with all the unanswered questions we have, I would think that the most prudent thing to do would be to stop the leak. And I'm not seeing that happen. Is there a potential for contamination to occur downstream? I don't know that. I can't answer that until I see the results of water quality testing.
And are those forthcoming to your knowledge? You've been talking to the ministry. Are you expecting to be able to see more data in the coming days or weeks?
I'm expecting that as a prudent organization and in the public interest, that the government is regularly out there taking samples on a daily basis and will be reporting on that on a daily basis. I have no idea whether they are. I take some comfort in the fact that there are various people from organizations like University of Northern BC in Prince George. There are people there from DSMOG Canada. There are people there from various other organizations. There are First Nations that have hired consultants, all to do independent testing and sampling. And I'm going to withhold any major conclusions at this point in time until I see the results of those samples.
Yeah.
Whether they're different or not, I don't know. I would be a little bit cautious, only a little bit cautious at this point, of trying to get out there and getting myself exposed to any of the potential chemicals that are in those tailings. One of the things about tailings is, and the good thing about this, I think I mentioned it, is that they're non-acid generating at this point. But that was because they were in a tailings pond and they were underwater. Now they're not underwater anymore. Acid generation in tailings can happen in a period of weeks. It can happen in a period of years. It all depends on the kinds and types of metals, the kinds of types of ore. I do know that the primary ore that was being mined at that site is associated with sulfides. It is associated with acid mine drainage. It's been managed to this point. Apparently the most likely substance or material that could potentially generate acid has been deposited in an abandoned pit called Caribou Pit. But that does not say that the mine tailings that are now outside the tailings pond, which are no longer underwater and which are now subject to oxidation, won't become acid generating. And if they do, then we're going to start facing bigger problems down the road with more metals being discharged in the environment. So it's a long-term thing. In the immediate short term, is there a danger? I believe, based on the information I've seen, that it's not a danger. Like, if you put your arm in Quesnel Lake, it's not going to dissolve. If you put your arm into Quesnel Lake, you're not going to be absorbing chemicals into your body to the point where you'll be sick or dead or dying. But over the long term, it's something that really needs to be monitored very carefully.
I'd like to finish off discussing a little bit the larger regulatory issues that have been brought to the fore, not the first time, but certainly a new spotlight has been put on in recent weeks from this Mount Polley situation. And I know this is an area of concern for you. There has been a trend of deregulation, both federally and provincially, with regards to fisheries, environment, and specifically mining here in BC. And I wonder if you could comment on that, and also the response from the province, from our top political leaders to this. Even the question whether it's a disaster or not, that's been debated by statements made by the mining Minister of Energy and Mines yesterday, trying to sort of downplay concerns. So I wonder if you could touch on that.
Well, it's a touchy subject, but one of the things that we at the David Suzuki Foundation and other organizations across Canada have been very concerned about is this movement to deregulate and to put faith in industry that everything that is environmentally important or any barriers that are in their way to getting mine approval, uh, that they be short-circuited so the mine approvals are quicker than they have been in the past. I think there's going to be a significant lack of oversight, and has been a significant lack of oversight for some time. And in talking to Ministry of Environment people right now, they're absolutely stretched to the limit. They don't have the capacity within government to actually go out and inspect these mines on a regular basis. They don't need, right now, even dealing with this Mount Polley situation, they're maxed. I mean, there are people there that are working like around the clock just to try to confirm the results that are coming in, and they don't have the capacity to do that. So the movement over the past decade has been to start putting the responsibility for environmental protection square in the hands of the companies that are responsible for mining, logging, and doing all of these other resource extraction activities, including oil and gas. And I'm very concerned about that, and have been for some time. Without regulation, we start to see non-compliance, and this has been shown time and time and time again. In this particular case, from what I understand and from all the information I've seen, that not only has the Ministry of Environment addressed this issue with mine tailings pond instability with the company, but so too have the company's own consultants, their engineers, the consultants they deal with, and employees at the mine. And yet, instead of doing the most prudent thing, which would have been to, okay, let's start slowing down production here. Let's take all the steps necessary to shore up this tailings pond and make sure that we're not going to have a problem down the road. The mine took the complete opposite action and decided to ramp up production and make more money. And that's what it's all about, feed the stakeholder. And that whole dynamic needs to change. Moving forward, we need better regulation, more stringent control. We need more staffing in the Ministry of Environment and government offices related to mining. We need less oversight by these companies. And I think that this particular issue is going to be a very significant problem for Imperial Metals moving forward, because they have two other properties they want to develop right now in British Columbia. One is the Red Chris mine, and the other one is Ruddock Creek. And I would think that the people in those areas, or potentially affected by those areas, in particular First Nations, are going to have a lot to say about that moving forward.
Well, we're already seeing that. Both of them have actually, one issued an eviction notice yesterday regarding the southern mine that you just mentioned, and the other Red Chris, which is northwest British Columbia. There's been a blockade initiated by the Klabana Waterkeepers of the Tahltan Nation. So we're starting to see the fallout almost immediately now within First Nations communities, certainly.
Right. And, you know, it's really unfortunate in some respects, only because, like, mining is a necessary evil. If you want to call it an evil, it's a necessary resource industry. We need minerals to support our lifestyle. The unfortunate part here is that the mining industry has now got a really big black eye and something that they have to deal with moving forward. However, now there are ways to manage tailings that have been developed over the past decade that are not currently being used here in Canada or in other areas. And the primary reason that they're not being used is cost. It's much cheaper to build a tailings dam and put a whole slurry of mine tailings waste and water behind that dam and put together I don't know, it's a really tough word to choose, but a fanciful long-term management plan. How are we going to manage these tailings? Because you have to manage them for a long time. The other option is to take advantage of new technologies. There's one called dry stacking, and what they do then is that before they dump their tailings, they remove 90% of the water and they form a brick. Then those bricks are formed and then they're stacked, and they can be stacked in various areas. And then once they're stacked, you can manage the water that goes through those areas and prevent water from coming into contact with those stacked tailings and reduce and eliminate acid mine drainage and things like that. However, it's much more expensive than building a traditional tailings pond, right? And I think what we need to start doing is seeing an industry becoming a little bit more responsible. If we want this industry to be sustainable into the future and to have the social license to operate, then they really need to seriously look at how they're doing things. And right now, it's profit over the environment. It's profit over everything. And that dynamic needs to change.
And you can see here how that short-term focus on profit can ultimately be detrimental to their shareholders' goals. When a mine gets shut down, Huckleberry, another property of Imperial Metals, has been shut down as a result of some unanticipated complications there. So and now Red Chris is potentially up in the air. So you can see how this type of mismanagement ultimately might not be good for anybody involved. I wonder, do you think that this incident, based on the reaction in the public, in the media, is enough of a catalyst to drive the necessary changes sort of philosophically in the industry, how they approach these issues, and particularly with this provincial government? We really have seen, in my view, the Premier has kind of gone silent mode here the last couple of weeks. We've seen the minister responsible here has been relatively defensive, I think. It would be a fair characterization of the industry, and the communications we've seen come forward have been largely designed to quell concerns. I wonder if, from your perspective, this is a big enough incident here that there'll be enough momentum to sort of start unwinding or changing some of the regulatory gutting that has happened over the last couple of years at the provincial level, or if this is just going to slip by and we go back to business as usual.
In my opinion, the answer to that question lies in the people of the province of British Columbia and the people of Canada. Governments will only respond when they are put in their place, when they are held accountable for what they do. And if people look at this situation and blank it out of their minds and go silent, I see this as just being another one of those, oh, it's a short-term memory thing, don't worry about it, it's gone, it's happened, it's done. But if people continue to focus on this, continue to put the pressure on the government, and continue to put pressure on the industry, including their stakeholders. I mean, come on, their stakeholders did not get invested in this particular mining property to face an incident like this. So the stakeholders need to hold the company accountable, and they are doing so with a significant loss in stock value. But we need to have the voices of the people in Canada to start speaking out against these kinds of environmental injustices. Otherwise, they're going to continue to occur. The David Suzuki Foundation right now is proposing and is in the process of doing an across Canada tour to get the right to a healthy environment established in the Constitution of Canada. With something like that happening, now governments cannot undermine rules and regulations that put the environment at risk. Governments, when they introduce rules and regulations, have to take into consideration environmental perspectives, and we wholly encourage that kind of thing. But the most important thing right now is that we start seeing people, ordinary people, and including people watching this video, to start actually speaking out and holding the government and the industry accountable for their actions to this point.
Thank you very much for your time, John. I'd love to speak with you some more as you get a chance to look at some of the new test results that come out and hear your perspective going forward.
Okay, if anything comes up, Damien, I will be contacting you and letting you know.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Take care.
You too.